quiet morning, and this one starts with a story from the book that's genuinely hard to read. A race that ended not in a disappointing finish, but in a real medical emergency. Kidney failure severe enough to require immediate hospital treatment. That's not a metaphorical harm warning. It's about as close to a complete, undeniable failure as an athletic attempt can produce, body breaking down in a way no amount of what could argue past. The chapter is called The Empowerment of Failure, and its argument is almost uncomfortable to state plainly. That specific, severe failure, examined honestly afterward, turned out to be more useful than any of the successes covered in the chapters before it. Not because failure feels good, it clearly didn't, but because failure exposes exactly where something actually broke down with a precision success rarely offers. A successful race tells you the plan worked. A failed one tells you, specifically, which part of the plan didn't, which is a considerably more useful piece of information if the goal is actually getting better rather than just feeling good about a single outcome. I want to spend this whole episode on that distinction because I think it's different from an idea covered a few episodes of the previous book, the structured debrief process for reviewing any outcome, success, or failure alike. That was a neutral tool, applied evenly regardless of result. This chapter is arguing something sharper. That failure specifically, examined without flinching, carries a density of useful information success simply doesn't produce, and that avoiding failure to protect feelings means avoiding exactly the richest source of real improvement available. It's worth being direct about why this idea sits 22 episodes into a series that spent nearly all of that time focused on consistency, discipline, showing up. Everything covered so far has, in one way or another, been about avoiding unnecessary failure, tracking honestly enough to catch problems early, testing beliefs carefully, respecting real signals. None of that guidance eliminates failure altogether, and it was never meant to. This chapter is for the failures that happen anyway, despite genuinely reasonable precautions. And it's arguing that those specific failures deserve to be treated as something considerably more valuable than simple bad luck to be endured and forgotten. Here's the core claim worth sitting with directly. A successful outcome confirms that a plan worked well enough, but it rarely reveals exactly why or which specific margin of error might have caused a different result under slightly worse conditions. A failure, examined honestly, exposes the actual, specific point of breakdown precisely in a way success almost never does. Goggins' kidney failure wasn't a vague, general reminder to be more careful. It revealed something specific and correctable, exact patterns around hydration, and pushing through warning signs that have been ignored rather than misunderstood. That specificity is what this chapter means by empowerment. Not that failure feels empowering in the moment. It doesn't, but that it hands over a uniquely precise diagnostic that a comfortable success would have left completely hidden. There's a reason success is so much less informative than failure in this specific way, worth naming directly rather than just asserting. A plan that works leaves its own margins completely untested. It's genuinely impossible to know, from a successful outcome alone, whether the plan succeeded with a comfortable margin to spare or barely scraped by on the thinnest possible edge of working at all. Both scenarios produce an identical successful result from the outside. Only a failure, by definition, reveals which side of that margin the plan was actually operating on, which is exactly the information a string of comfortable successes can never provide, no matter how many of them accumulate. This has a specific, slightly unsettling implication worth sitting with honestly. A long streak of unbroken successes might mean a plan with genuinely wide margins, or might just as easily mean a plan that's been quietly running close to its real limits the entire time, with nobody able to tell the difference until something finally goes wrong. That's not a reason to feel anxious about every success. It's a reason to treat this chapter's core claim seriously rather than dismissing it as simply making the best of a bad situation after the fact. Failure isn't just tolerable feedback. According to this chapter, it's sometimes the only feedback capable of answering a question's success was never actually equipped to answer on its own. I want to bring this into something personal because this channel has had its own version of a real, significant failure, distinct from the smaller plateaus and setbacks covered in earlier episodes. There was a specific attempt, roughly 8 months into this project, at a distance well beyond anything attempted before, that ended not with a slower-than-hope finish, but with an actual stop partway, through, forced by symptoms serious enough that continuing would have been genuinely reckless rather than simply uncomfortable. That failure, looked at honestly afterward using exactly the kind of unflinching examination this chapter describes, revealed something the many previous successful runs never had. The specific point where the fueling plan actually broke down, identifiable with a precision no successful run had ever demanded uncovering. I remember how differently that failure felt in the moment compared to how it eventually got used. In the moment, it felt purely like defeat, a distance not covered, a plan not completed, nothing about it feeling like it carried any hidden value at all. It took several days before the idea of actually examining it closely, rather than just filing it away as a disappointing outcome, even occurred to me. And I think that delay is worth naming honestly, because this chapter's argument only actually works if the examination eventually happens, and the emotional weight of a real failure makes that examination genuinely difficult to start. Every one of the successful runs leading up to that attempt had been successful partly by accident, never actually testing the fueling plan's real limits, because the distances involved had never pushed hard enough against them to reveal where the breakdown point actually Saturday the failure did what months of successful, comfortable runs never could. It located the exact boundary, specifically, rather than leaving it as a vague, untested assumption sitting somewhere beyond whatever had already been comfortably proven. That's the empowerment this chapter is actually describing, not a feeling a specific, usable piece of information that had never been available before the failure actually happened. There's a distinction worth drawing between this idea and the debrief process covered a few episodes into the previous book, because they can sound similar without actually being the same tool. The debrief was a neutral, structured comparison, applied evenly to any outcome, asking what was planned versus what actually happened. This chapter is arguing something more specific. That failure carries a unique density of information success doesn't, which means a failure deserves a deeper, more thorough version of that same examination than a comfortable success typically requires. ***, a successful run's debrief might take 2 minutes. A real failure's debrief, done the way this chapter describes, deserves considerably more, precisely because there's more genuinely useful information sitting inside it, waiting to actually be extracted rather than quickly logged and moved past. I think this distinction matters enough to make even more explicit, because it's easy to assume more effort automatically applied everywhere is simply more thorough. That's not quite what this chapter is arguing. A successful run genuinely doesn't need the same depth of examination a real failure does. Not because success is unimportant, but because success, by definition, didn't expose a breakdown point the way failure did. Applying the deep, detailed version of this process to every single outcome regardless of whether it succeeded or failed would be exhausting and largely wasted effort. The skill this chapter is actually describing is knowing when the deeper version is actually warranted, reserving it specifically for the failures significant enough to be carrying real, extractable information. I want to walk through what that deeper examination actually looks like, because mind the failure for information stays abstract without a concrete method attached. The process that's worked for the fueling failure covered a moment ago involved going back through the specific timeline of that attempt in unusual detail, not just noting that it failed, but reconstructing, as precisely as memory allowed, exactly when things started going wrong, what the earliest warning signs actually were, and at what point continuing stopped being reasonable. That level of detail is more than a typical debrief requires, and it's more than felt comfortable to sit with that. the time. It's also exactly what actually produced the specific, correctable insight a lighter review would have missed entirely. I want to walk through the actual timeline reconstruction in enough detail to make the method concrete rather than just described in the abstract. The first pass simply listed every hour of the attempt in sequence, noting fueling intake, effort level, and any physical sensation worth mentioning at each point, without yet trying to draw any conclusions from the pattern. Only once that full, honest timeline existed on paper did the second pass begin, looking specifically for the earliest point where something had already started diverging from what a successful attempt's timeline would have looked like. That earliest divergence point turned out to be considerably earlier than the moment the symptoms actually became impossible to ignore, roughly 2 hours before the actual stop, in a specific gap between planned and actual fluid intake that had seemed too minor to worry about at the time. That specific finding, 2 hours of advance warning buried inside a seemingly minor gap, is exactly the kind of precise, actionable information this chapter is arguing failure uniquely provides. A successful attempt covering the same distance would never have revealed that specific 2-hour warning window, because the plan would have held up well enough that the gap never got tested against real consequences. Only the failure actually pushed hard enough against the plan's real margins to expose exactly where and when the first crack had actually appeared. There's a boundary worth being extremely precise about here, because this chapter's argument, taken without real care, can tip into something genuinely dangerous, especially given this channel's entire history with real physical injuries. This chapter is not an argument for seeking failure deliberately or treating every risk as worth taking simply because failure produces useful information. The specific failure in this book's own story was a genuine medical emergency, not a controlled experiment, and the chapter's value comes from what got learned afterward, not from any suggestion that the failure itself should have been courted on purpose. ***, the empowerment this chapter describes is retrospective, extracting maximum value from a failure that already happened, not a license to court dangerous outcomes deliberately in the hope of extracting a lesson from them. I want to be honest about how tempting this misreading actually is, because it's easy to hear failure is more valuable than success, and quietly conclude that failure should therefore be pursued more often. That conclusion doesn't follow from anything this chapter actually argues, and it's worth being direct about why. The value this chapter describes comes specifically from failures that happen despite genuine, reasonable effort to avoid them, not from failures manufactured on purpose to harvest a lesson. A deliberately courted failure isn't carrying the same kind of information at all, because it's not actually testing the honest limits of a real, careful attempt. It's just producing a predictable outcome dressed up afterward in this chapter's language. I want to add one more layer to this boundary, because there's a subtler version of the same mistake worth naming too. Even without deliberately courting failure outright, there's a quieter risk of unconsciously lowering the care applied to preparation, on the theory that a failure, if it happens, will just become useful material anyway. That's a rationalization worth catching early, because it quietly undermines exactly the kind of honest, careful attempt this chapter's whole argument depends on. The failures worth mining this deeply are, by definition, the ones that happen despite real care, not the ones made more likely by a subtle relaxation of that care in the back of the mind. I've noticed a version of this rationalization creep into my own thinking more than once, usually dressed up as something reasonable sounding rather than obviously careless. A thought like, even if this doesn't go perfectly, I'll learn something from it either way, can sound like healthy resilience while quietly functioning as permission to prepare less carefully than the attempt actually deserved. The honest version of that same sentiment keeps the two things separate. Prepare as carefully as the attempt genuinely warrants, and separately, if a real failure happens anyway despite that care, commit to examining it thoroughly rather than just moving past it. Blending those two into one sentence is exactly where the subtle version of this misapplication tends to sneak in. I want to be direct about how this boundary actually gets applied, because it matters enough to state plainly given who this channel has always been built for. A failure that happens despite reasonable precautions, respected warning signs, and honest attention to real signals deserves exactly the deep examination this chapter describes. A failure caused by deliberately ignoring warning signs specifically to see what would happen isn't the same category of event at all, and mining it for lessons afterward doesn't retroactively make the original decision to ignore those signs a reasonable one. The fueling failure covered earlier happened despite real attention to the warning signs available at the time, which is exactly why it qualified for this kind of deep examination rather than simply being a predictable consequence of recklessness that should have been caught earlier. This connects directly to something covered a couple episodes back: the accurate internal narration distinguishing productive discomfort from real damage. A failure worth mining this deeply is usually one where that internal narration was actually being checked honestly against real evidence, and the breakdown happened anyway, at a point the available information genuinely couldn't have predicted in advance. A failure that happened because the accurate narration was ignored in favor of the automatic, catastrophizing, or falsely confident version isn't a mysterious, information-rich event requiring deep excavation. It's simply a case where an already known process didn't get followed, and the lesson is considerably more straightforward than this chapter's deeper examination process is actually built for. I want to walk through what actually applying this looks like as a practice, because the idea of deeply mining a real failure needs something concrete to translate into rather than staying a general principle. The next time a real, significant failure happens, not a minor missed checkpoint, but something closer to a genuine breakdown, give it the deeper version of the debrief process rather than the lighter, routine version. Reconstruct the actual timeline in detail, not just what happened, but when the earliest signs actually appeared, what they looked like at the time, and specifically what information, if it had been available or acted on differently, might have changed the outcome. Write that reconstruction down in full, rather than compressing it into a quick summary the way a routine debrief usually would. I want to add one specific detail that made this process considerably more useful the second time I applied it, having learned something from doing it the first time somewhat imperfectly. The reconstruction works best when it's done without judgment mixed into the timeline itself. Description first, evaluation second, kept as two clearly separate passes rather than blended together. The first pass through the fueling failures timeline mixed description and self-criticism together so thoroughly that the actual useful details got buried under the emotional weight of the failure itself. A second, more careful pass, describing what happened plainly before allowing any evaluation of it, surfaced the specific correctable insight far more clearly than the first attempt had. I want to add one more practical note about timing, because a real failure's emotional weight makes it genuinely difficult to begin this process immediately, and forcing it too soon can produce exactly the same blended, judgment-heavy mess the first attempt at this ran into. A short waiting period, a few days rather than a few hours, seems to allow enough emotional distance for the description first, evaluation second approach to actually work as intended. Waiting too long, on the other hand, risks losing the specific, granular details a fresher memory holds onto more reliably. Somewhere in that few-day window seems to be where this process actually works best, close enough to the event that details are still sharp, distant enough that the raw emotional reaction has settled enough to allow a genuinely honest, separated examination. There's one more piece worth adding to the practice, specific to how the resulting insight actually gets used afterward rather than just filed away as an interesting finding. Once the specific, precise lesson has actually been extracted, the way the 2-hour fueling gap eventually was, it deserves to be built directly into the next attempt's actual plan, not just remembered vaguely as a general caution. The fueling schedule for every long attempt since that failure has explicitly accounted for that specific 2-hour window by name, rather than relying on a general sense of having learned something important from the experience. Specific insights deserve specific, written changes to the next plan, not just a vaguer, harder to apply increase in general caution. Tomorrow morning, if a real failure happens, not the ordinary kind that gets logged and set aside quickly, but the kind that actually stops something in its tracks, it's carrying more useful information than any comfortable success from the weeks before it ever could. That information doesn't extract itself automatically just because the failure happened. It requires the same deliberate, detailed, unflinching examination this chapter describes. Uncomfortable as that examination genuinely is, precisely because the discomfort is what the rest of the series has already argued, is usually where the most useful material actually lives. I think it's worth naming, before closing this one out, why a chapter built around something as serious as a medical emergency earned a full episode on a channel that tried to stay measured and careful about exactly this kind of intensity. It would have been easy to soften this chapter's story into something safer, a metaphor rather than an actual account of real physical crisis. That would have missed the point this chapter is actually making. The information this chapter describes as uniquely valuable is valuable precisely because the failure producing it was real, consequential, and genuinely frightening in the moment, not because it was a mild inconvenience easy to reframe as a learning opportunity after the fact. Some lessons only carry the weight this chapter is describing because the failure that produced them actually mattered, and pretending otherwise, to make the story more comfortable, would have undersold exactly what makes this idea genuinely useful. There's a specific thread connecting this chapter back to something from very early in this whole series, worth naming as this episode closes. The very first episode argued that the honest sentence, said plainly instead of softened, was the entire foundation everything else got built on. This chapter is really the same argument, applied to the hardest possible version of an honest sentence, the one describing an actual, significant failure in full, unflinching detail, rather than a softened summary easier to sit with. 22 episodes later, across 2 books, the foundation hasn't actually changed. It's just being asked to hold considerably more weight now than it was back at the very beginning, and it's worth noting, honestly, that the foundation has actually held up under that weight so far, which is its own small piece of evidence for everything this series has argued the whole way through. I'll see you on the trail tomorrow. Same time, same choice, whether yesterday went well or genuinely didn't. This is Run to Evolve. One day, one run, one lesson, no excuses.